Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Sabrina Sembiante, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about discourse analysis and applications in education. So I wanted to start with this quote about invisible ideology, which I'll read to you. It says, ideology, which by the way we understand as shared values, beliefs, assumptions, and theories, is at its most powerful when it is invisible, when discourses have been naturalized and become part of our everyday common sense. So one way to look at naturalized discourses in our society and the assumptions that are made on the basis of shared values is to look at some of the comments that presidential candidates have made during the 2015-2016 campaign trail. So I'll read these to you. This one is from John Kasich, on the topic of avoiding sexual assault. Well, I'd also give you one bit of advice. Don't go to parties where there's a lot of alcohol, okay? Don't do that. Here's one from Donald Trump. Happy Cinco de Mayo. The best taco bowls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics. Here's another one from Donald Trump on affirmative action. A well-educated black has a tremendous advantage over a well-educated white in terms of the job market. If I were starting off today, I would love to be a well-educated black because I believe they do have an actual advantage. And from Ted Cruz, who was talking about the Texas Longhorns' loss to Iowa State Cyclones, he says, I think they canceled their football program and brought in a girls' junior high team. So, these comments were made with the assumptions around shared values, which candidates invoke in hopes of building common ground or gaining support from voters who they think share similar beliefs or perspectives. But in each one of these comments, the candidates are displaying ideologies that they believe are normalized, right, naturalized, and that are shared in society. But if we take a closer look at the language and question what they're saying, what we reveal is really a deep bias and deep inequities. So, for example, in John Kasich's comment, we see this idea that sexual assault or rape is the fault of the victim or can be prohibited by the victim, the many of whom are usually females. In other words, the accountability falls on the victim, the female, rather than the perpetrator, the male. In this comment from Donald Trump, we see that this idea that people from diverse cultures and backgrounds, number one, can be grouped together based on stereotypes. And also, number two, there's a complete misrepresentation of these people's unique cultures and backgrounds. The comment on affirmative action shows us this idea that systemic racism does not exist anymore, and that those who have been systemically oppressed function off of some advantage, which is unjustified. Okay? And lastly, in this comment from Ted Cruz, there's this idea that women are in general less and cannot be taken seriously when compared to men. So I wanted to start here because if we take a deeper look at the comments of these candidates, which were said in sort of a very normalized fashion, it really reveals how important it is to take that deeper look at the language. Okay, and so it helps us to think about critical discourse analysis, or at least it ties to the topic of critical discourse analysis. So this is the study of language in use among people. It's an interdisciplinary approach to study that language. And critical discourse analysts view language as a form of social practice. So where inequities such as power abuse, dominance, inequality, all of those are enacted, reproduced, reinforced, and resisted through language. Okay? So in order for critical discourse analysts to understand inequality and to expose it, they look at language and they analyze language for evidence of these injustices. So then the question is, what does critical discourse analysis help us to do? And I wanted to read you these two very good quotes discussing what it helps us to do. I'll read these to you. A discourse-based educational research would set itself the work of taking that which offers itself as commonsensical, as obvious, as natural, given, or unquestionable, and trying to unravel it a bit, to open it up to further questioning. One of the main tasks of discourse analysis is to disarticulate the texts of everyday life as a way of disrupting common sense about the naturalness or inevitability of identities, values, and concepts, thus showing the workings of power and material interests in the most seemingly innocent of texts. So basically, it allows you to reveal social inequalities, and it also puts you in a position to question those inconsistencies in mainstream discourses. So some of the ways that your readings have discussed doing this is through asking the following questions. Number 1, how do more powerful groups control public discourse? Number 2, how does such discourse control mind and action of less powerful groups? And number 3, what are the social consequences of such control, such as social inequality? So I wanted to reframe these questions for you in the context of education, and particularly in curriculum. So the first one would be, how do groups in power control the language and content of curriculum? The second would be, how does that language and content of curriculum indoctrinate, reproduce, and maintain the current power inequalities? And number 3, what are the consequences of teaching students through a curriculum that is designed to do this, right? To indoctrinate, reproduce, and maintain those inequalities. So, social inequality and domination can also be thought of occurring in particular areas. For example, ethnicity, religion, race, nationality, social class, socioeconomics, language and dialect, ability versus disability, gender, and sexual orientation. And we can use these categories to organize the way that we take a deeper look or analysis into the language of textbooks. And remember, textbooks are really very important artifacts in the classroom because it is the primary way in which curriculum is conveyed, right? Carried out in the classroom. So I want to show you, we're going to do a quick analysis of the following text. It's a page out of a 4th grade social studies text that is used in Miami-Dade County. And the unit is focused on exploration and settlement in the context of Florida. So I'll read to you the first piece. It talks about a Spanish conquistador and native warrior, and it compares the two. It says, the Spanish conquistador at the left had more powerful tools for fighting than the native warrior at the right. And then it lists all of the different tools that were at their disposal. The body of the text reads, 2 ways of life clash. The native Floridians tried to resist or act against the Spanish. Some burned their own homes and farms to keep the Spanish from taking them. Others trapped or attacked the Spanish. The Spanish had steel-tipped spears, swords, guns, metal armor, and horses. Native Floridians had never fought against weapons like these. Some Europeans unknowingly brought diseases such as smallpox and measles to the Americas. These diseases spread quickly and often killed whole villages. So the first thing we can ask ourselves is, who is pictured and discussed in this text and who is not? So we notice that obviously pictured are 2 men, each from the different sides, Spanish conquistador and native warrior. But if we look at the subjects of the sentences in the text, we also see that the majority are the native Floridians, the Spanish, right? And other references. These are references back to the native Floridians. So the assumption here is that these are men, right? So we can see off the bat that women are wholly missing from this text. If we ask ourselves the question, how are the Spanish conquistadors portrayed in contrast to native Floridians? So we can see that every time Spanish conquistadors are discussed, we see them being discussed in terms of the focus on their technological assets. So here we see Spanish conquistadors had more powerful tools for fighting. Also, the Spanish had steel-tipped spears. So here, notice how the verb have is continually being used. And remember, have tells us about ownership. So the focus is very much on the Spanish material wealth. We also see when the text discusses some of the negative events that took place with the coming of the Europeans, such as diseases. We see features in the text operating to help the Spanish evade any sort of blame. So we see here the Europeans unknowingly brought diseases, right? Unknowingly. Also, at the end, we see these diseases spread quickly and often killed whole villages. So instead of saying the Europeans killed the native Floridians because they brought over disease, right? To show that very direct cause and effect. Instead, we see the text replacing that with diseases, right? Which becomes then another way for the conquistadors to evade blame. Instead, if we look at the way that native Floridians are talked about in the text, we notice that the types of verbs that are being used with native Floridians are very much of violence and rebellion. So here we see the native Floridians try to resist or act against, right? So the idea here is rebellion. But if we were to use different types of verbs, such as instead of resisting, protecting themselves, right? Instead of acting against, defending themselves. Those types of verbs help students to understand that, it was in defense of their land or in defense because they were being attacked, right? This resistance and acting against is definitely indicating that they were initiating the war, right? Or that they were acting in a way that was, requiring that the Spanish then fight against them. Other verbs that were used, trapped or attacked, again, very violent, very war-based. And so really no mention of the Spanish role in initiating and carrying out the war that we know happened. Also, if we ask ourselves the question on what basis are the two compared, we see that comparisons are made on mere strength, on the technological advances of the Spanish, right? And so, of course, comparing on those bases is not really very fair, right, towards the two. We don't instead see a focus on who had rights to the land. I mean, those are very pertinent, very relevant points to make in a text such as this. We also don't see connections to the skills, context-based skills that the native Floridians had developed in order to survive in that land. We also don't see references back to the cultural, social, or geographical aspects supporting styles of dress, right? Styles of weapons. So basically, especially in this first piece where the comparison is made, the native Floridians are construed as weak or even ill-prepared, or even as to blame for having been defeated because of the manner of their dress and their weapons, right? No reference made to culture or the realities of their lifestyle that required such dress and such tools. So we can see clearly that the text reflects the experiences of one group, one particular group versus the other, and also it makes one group look better or even provides them more justification than the other. So if we go back to our three original questions, the first one being, how do groups in power control the language and content of curriculum? We see that Spanish conquistadors are shown as justified to take land from native Floridians. In the second question, talking about how does the language indoctrinate, reproduce, and maintain those inequalities, we see misrepresentation of native Floridians and denial of their Holocaust at the hands of Europeans. We see the belief that Europeans and other U.S. residents are inherently entitled to the land in Florida. And then in terms of the third question, the consequences of such a curriculum, teaching such a curriculum, we see that students progressing through school would progress without knowing the realities of social inequalities and injustices, or learning about the contributions and existence of those people from disenfranchised groups, right? So these students are not seeing themselves as valuable and worthy in society. But remember that teachers and researchers, as critical discourse analysts, can question and disrupt the workings of power in text and curriculum. And so we see the really important use of this approach and tool. Thank you very much.